Content warning. This is a video about a horror film that relies pretty heavily on jump scares and gore, which I will do my best to avoid, but these puppets are pretty freaky looking on their own. Also, there will be spoilers, but I don't think having the plot spoiled is going to ruin your experience. It's really not that kind of movie. Willy's Wonderland. That was a movie. It was released more than a full calendar year ago. It's a movie that is, let's say, inspired by the Five Nights at Freddy's games, but it dares to ask the question, what if Nicolas Cage? I liked it quite a lot, but there's also a lot I would fix. Why am I doing this? Because it was my birthday recently, and I wanted to do something nice for myself. Sometimes you gotta do that. Just do something nice for yourself. And if you can't on your birthday, then when can you? I won't tell you how old I turned, but I'll give you a hint. On my 13th birthday, I cashed out my Dolomites account to buy an MP3 player with 1 GB of storage. The first album I put on it was the Scooby-Doo soundtrack. That's not part of the hint, I just think it's a good soundtrack. Bangers left and right. Nothing but bangers. Okay, there are some non-bangers, but Outkast did an original song for the soundtrack, which more than makes up for the non-bangers. I'm getting sidetracked. Willy's Wonderland is, on paper, exactly my idea of a good time. In execution, it is still pretty much my idea of a good time, but some of it falls flat. Most of its problems aren't even really problems, they're just factors of the budget, so I don't think it would be fair to hold those against the movie. I get it, not everyone is Sam Raimi, and that's okay. Most people are not Sam Raimi. I would know, I'm not Sam Raimi. That's actually the first thing they teach you in film school. Day 1, lecture 1, not everyone is Sam Raimi, and that's fine. You don't have to be Sam Raimi. The problems I want to discuss today are the kind of things that I, a nobody, could have solved. If they'd asked, I could have provided my services as a script doctor, and I would have improved it a great deal. But they didn't ask, and to be fair, I don't know how they would have found me. My LinkedIn profile lists me as a former IT consultant and current podcaster, which is exactly the kind of person who would think they'd make a good script doctor, but not the type to get cold called by studios. The plot of Willy's Wonderland follows Nicolas Cage's character, whose car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. The repairs are going to be expensive, but luckily the mechanic will do them for free because he has a buddy whose restaurant needs cleaning. What luck! I'm sure this is completely normal. Oh god, no! No! Oh no! At its best, Willy's Wonderland feels like one of those schlocky, campy 80s horror movies where the plot is this bizarre high-concept thing that the budget can't keep up with, but there's a veritable waterfall of fake blood and you're having a great time. At its worst, Willy's Wonderland is like one of those schlocky, campy 80s horror movies where the plot is this bizarre high-concept thing that the budget can't keep up with, but there's a veritable waterfall of fake blood and you're having a bad time. This is a 90-minute movie that doesn't have much plot. What plot there is, it gets straight to without much messing around. There are some flashbacks that pad out the runtime, which I'll get to, but otherwise the pacing is done quite well. It knows when to introduce what and when to cut from A plot to B plot. The dialogue does a mostly good job of establishing character. Most of the character motivation makes sense, though there are some contrivances you just kinda have to deal with and some disastrous decisions that, again, I'll get to. Willy's Wonderland is at its best when it's Nicolas Cage fighting puppets. Fortunately, that's most of the movie. His character, who is listed in the credits as the janitor, has a lot of backstory that is never explained. Why doesn't he talk? Why is he on such a strict soda schedule? How'd he get so good at cleaning? Why does pinball cause in him a level of excitement that seems sexual? The movie answers none of these questions, and that is the right call. It's surprising actually, because a lot of things are over-explained, which I'll get to. Like a lot of people, I used to think that Nicolas Cage was a bad actor. In my defense, I only knew him from the It's a Living stage of his career. When someone recommended I watch Adaptation, a movie in which Cage gives not one but 2 terrific performances, I updated my opinion and believed that Nicolas Cage was an actor who is exactly as good as the movie that he's in. But that's not quite right either. It was only getting swept up in Mandy fever that made me realize that good and bad are not words that can be accurately applied to Nicolas Cage's acting. The correct word is dedicated. Nicolas Cage is an actor who gives 110% at all times, even when the film in question deserves at most 12%. This is what makes him the perfect actor to take on a role like this. A silent, soda-chugging, pinball-playing drifter is perfectly placed to ground a movie in which freaky animatronic puppets have turned murderous. His role is a lot like Michael Caine in The Muppets Christmas Carol. Michael Caine is surrounded by the goofiest creatures on God's green earth, and he plays his role with a seriousness and gravitas that would give the Royal Shakespeare Company a run for its money. The dialogue of the puppets can be divided into 2 categories. Dialogue that is scary because it's the kind of thing a puppet would say but in a new context that makes it threatening.
I've waited so long for a girl to play with.
And dialogue that is scary because it's not the kind of thing a puppet would say.
I'm gonna eat your eyes out and then feast on your soul.
The first is much more effective. The second is just, what if Elmo said fuck? Which is fine, but it's not a whole movie. Avenue Q both defined and perfected the genre of what if Elmo said fuck, and sure, it's possible that something like the Happy Time murders outdid the pure, unadulterated display of id that was two Sesame Street-style puppets 69ing, but I'm not going to watch it just to make this specific point. Could I have made this point with Team America, a movie that I have seen and do remember? Maybe. But that's just not the kind of life I'm living. The point is, what if Elmo said fuck is the kind of thing that makes a great vine, but the joke gets stale after a bit. If I had to guess, I'd say that what happened is the writer of Willy's Wonderland started in the first mode, the things a children's entertainment puppet would say but in a new context that makes it scary mode, but gave up because of, if I'm being generous, time constraints. It's a real shame because one of the best scares of the movie is in that mode. Willy sings a song that might have been part of a show for a birthday party, all about being a cheeky weasel, getting up to mischief and stealing livestock for food. Just mustard things. In this new context, it's effectively a serial killer taunting his victims. It goes on for a bit, building the tension, then BAM! A jump scare to break the tension and introduce a new action beat. Just some textbook perfect horror filmmaking. Outstanding. By contrast, it's less scary or interesting when the puppets are like, "What up? It's murdering time, fuckers! I know what sex is and I'm gonna kill you for fun." The puppets have a whole backstory, not all of which is necessary. Knowing how much background information to give your audience is a delicate balance. You don't want to spoon-feed them information like you don't think they can pick it up on their own, but you don't want to give them nothing, especially when your whole movie is built around a supernatural mystery. As I said before, it's definitely the right call to explain nothing about the janitor's backstory, but as a trade-off, the restaurant and the whole deal with it is over-explained to death. There are two flashbacks, one explaining how the puppets got like this, and one explaining the relationship of the people in the town to the restaurant. The first is pointless. Puppets are freaky because they're freaky. Just deal with it. The second is interesting because it builds the intergenerational drama. It explains that, hey, remember when the janitor's car broke down and he didn't have cash on hand to pay the mechanic, but luckily the mechanic was willing to do it for free in exchange for his buddy's restaurant getting cleaned? Wasn't that just a bit too convenient? Oh yeah, this has been happening for a long time and the sheriff is in on it. The kind of backstory that asks interesting questions about morality and justice. Why is the sheriff not okay with the creatures preying on people in town but is okay with feeding them outsiders? Why does a group of 3 people get to decide this while keeping it a secret from the rest of the town? If the rest of the town knew, would they decide anything different? This is a small group of people who do what has to be done to keep Willy and his compatriots contained, but at the cost of their own morality. So the fix is that only the second flashback stays, and instead of the first flashback you have characters going, yeah, nobody really knows what the deal with the puppets is, and then a bunch of people repeat different rumors about what the deal with the puppets is. Also, move the camera less, I'm dizzy. Oh, Kathy. Oh, Kathy. So now it's time to explain the everything else of this film. Nicolas Cage fighting puppets is fine and all, but you need the rest of the movie to justify it. There's a B-plot about teens getting up to hijinks. The sheriff's adopted daughter, Liv, can't take what this town is doing anymore and decides to burn Willy's Wonderland down, and all of her friends are on board. The sheriff feels some reasonable motherly concern about this, which she expresses by handcuffing Liv to some furniture so she can't go out while the sheriff is unable to supervise her. The sheriff and a deputy are on curfew duty all night, which brings them back into the action later. And of course, there's the mechanic and the owner of Willy's Wonderland, who are there to be shady. Most of the characters are perfectly fine. There's some believable tension between Liv and the sheriff, and among Liv's group of friends. They have a real vibe of people from a small town who are only friends because there aren't many people their age nearby. There's a whole thing about Liv taking her mission to burn down Willy's Wonderland way more seriously than her friends, and that neatly sets up her whole backstory. They all have a role to play in the group. There's Chris, who does reckless things to impress Liv. Aaron, who is always annoyed at Chris doing reckless things to impress Liv. There's Bob and Kathy, a couple who got together recently. And Dan, who wears glasses. Some of the characters are underwritten. It's not clear what glasses guy adds to the group, but overall it's mostly fine. Mostly. Liv's friends burst into the sheriff's trailer and find her handcuffed, and while most of the group scrambles around the trailer looking for the key, Kathy just picks the lock with a bobby pin, no big deal. After Liv gets stuck in Willy's Wonderland and all her friends debate whether they should go in and rescue her, Kathy, with that same level of calm, self-assured determination, leads the charge by climbing onto the roof. Later, Bob wants to leave and assumes Kathy will follow him, but she doesn't. She's here to rescue Liv. In a short amount of screen time, Kathy very economically establishes herself as loyal, resourceful, and brave. Despite all evidence to the contrary, the people around Kathy, including her boyfriend, constantly undermine her and treat her like she's just some TNA. And then the filmmakers undermine her and treat her like she's just some TNA.
Is it weird that I'm getting really turned on right now?
I want to be clear, the reason I'm against her choice to have sex in the worst possible location is not just because it's a bad idea that gets her and her boyfriend killed. That is part of it, but I'm not against people making bad decisions in fiction, even if it's an out-of-character decision that was clearly just made to move the plot forward. Sometimes you just have to accept a plot contrivance for the sake of watching an otherwise perfectly fine movie. I'm also not against sex scenes in movies, even gratuitous ones. I can accept grinding the plot to a halt so that two characters can have an intimate moment. I'm also painfully aware of the intimate link between sex and death in horror cinema, no pun intended. I too have watched Cabin in the Woods. I have read not only Her Body himself, but the other 3 chapters of Men, Women and Chainsaws. I do understand that there are certain genre expectations that writers play with, but you don't have to. I don't claim to be an aficionado of the genre, but I've watched enough of those schlocky 80s horror movies that are mostly a lot of fun, and then you have to sit through an excruciatingly long sex scene where the nature of consent is not addressed. So in comparison to that kind of film, it's actually pretty refreshing that in this movie's excruciatingly long sex scene, consent is enthusiastically given. What's maddening about this sex scene is that it's very clearly just there in order to have a sex scene. It's like someone was just sitting down in a meeting and then someone goes, yeah, but we gotta see them titties though. Gotta have a teen who's responsible for her own death because she had sex. Gotta have some weird moralistic message in there where we simultaneously leer at a woman's mostly naked body and then punish her for Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden. Oh yeah. It's the male gaze distilled to its most basic components. A woman's body is put on display for the enjoyment of men and then is destroyed as punishment for being put on display for the enjoyment of men. I made that reference to Cabin in the Woods earlier, but the more I think about it, the more it works as a comparison.
We've got the blood work back on Loudon. Her levels are good, but we're recommending a 50 milligram bump of rohiptase to increase libido.
Okay, baby, let's see some boobies.
Show us the goods.
Does it really matter if we see
We're not the only ones watching, Ken.
Gotta keep the customer satisfied. You understand what's at stake here.
Just like the shadowy organization drugging Kurt and Jules, manipulating them, changing their personalities to force them into roles that most conveniently facilitate a grisly death in service of a centuries-old sacrificial ritual that only allows for small variations on a largely unchanging structure, Willy's Wonderland forces a character to forego all the good sense she's established to have in order to satisfy the whims of whoever decided this part of the movie absolutely had to have a sex scene in it. It's honestly kind of impressive. It's like she's barely given any dialogue, but it completely contradicts all of her behavior. To improve this, she doesn't even need to survive. She could have died, but her death just should have been less than 100% her own fault. Here's my pitch. They split from the group, that stays the same. Bob thinks he can make it through the vents and get out. Kathy hears screaming and runs in to save Liv. Bob decides, you know what, actually this is the right thing to do, so he follows her. The roof collapse continues, some debris separates them from the rest of the group, and that alligator puppet's blocking their exit. They share a tearful goodbye, they go down swinging. I know it's not a perfect solution, but there are fewer contrivances than what we got. On the topic of character death, something I would have added is to make everyone else's death a bit more in line with their characters. This is something they do with the adult characters. The people who made the deal with Willy end up being killed by him. But it's something they could have extended to the meddling kids. Chris dies making a deal with one of the puppets, but I think this death should go to Aaron. Aaron was always trying to reason people out of going into the restaurant, so he should be killed trying to reason his way out. Chris is always making reckless decisions to impress Liv, so he should make an ill-advised attempt to save her. Dan has no character at all, so first you have to establish literally anything about him. He wears glasses, so clearly he's meant to be the nerd of the group. So establish that he's into vintage arcade games and then lure him away from the group with, Pong. Ooh, make it Polybius. Little shout out to the nerds. Hello nerds, have some Polybius. Willy's Wonderland was a fun movie. It's definitely flawed, but most of those flaws are still fun. Even with one catastrophic failure right there in the middle, it's worthwhile viewing. It satisfies a very basic human need I think we all have, to watch a man go 8 rounds against some puppets. It's nothing more than that, and it doesn't have to be. It's often less than that when it didn't need to be, but you know what? Someone had a truly ridiculous idea and got 90 minutes of movie out of it, which I'm always going to applaud. Thanks everyone for watching. If you like what I do, like and subscribe and consider donating to my Patreon. My credits still look like this. And you can make them less funny by donating. Let me know in the comments which of the meddling kids you are. I think I'm a Chris. This is a cynical request for engagement, but I also would genuinely like to know. Anyway, that's it from me. Stay safe and say hi to your pets for me.